Japan, the only country in history to have suffered a nuclear attack. During World War II, Japan and the United States were the fiercest of enemies.
An American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy.
But after the war, an alliance was formed.
Let me be crystal clear. The United States is fully, thoroughly, completely committed to the alliance.
From the ashes of war and hostility, these one-time violent enemies became uneasy partners. From enmity to alliance, has Japan been on a path of Americanization? Many consider the ensuing American occupation of Japan by Douglas MacArthur the defining milestone in Japan-U.S. relations.
Then comes the long-awaited moment when General MacArthur's car enters the American embassy grounds.
But in fact, the roots of American influence in Japan go further back. Long before MacArthur, another American naval officer came to Japan. He was Matthew Perry, an 18th century Commodore in the U.S. Navy. Even today, Japanese consider Perry's arrival had the greatest impact and changed the course of Japan's history. Back then, Japan was in its isolationist Edo period and had refrained from contact with the outside world for 2 centuries. All of that changed upon the arrival of Perry and his U.S. Navy fleet. The Americans wanted to force Japan into a trade deal as part of their effort to expand markets into Asia. Perry believed that by showing off U.S. advanced firepower, he could intimidate the Japanese into opening up their markets and accepting Western trade. With minimal effort, Perry achieved the desired result. Under pressure, the Japanese grudgingly agreed to Perry's demands, promising that all future concessions Japan granted to other foreign powers would also be granted to the United States. This would become a recurring theme in Japan-U.S. relations. Japan's next wave of Westernization, or rather Americanization, would occur during the U.S. occupation after World War II.
Hiroshima, seen from the air after the atomic bomb blast that virtually erased this city of 340,000 people from the earth.
The U.S. entered the war after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The two nations would be locked in bloody conflict through the remainder of the war.
Taking his place at the surrender table,
2 atomic bombs dropped by the U.S. would force Japan's surrender. The U.S. would defeat Japan. It would also punish, reform, and rebuild Japan.
Complete with Nipponese bulls and bears and a crowd scene that looks like a dogfight.
The Allies punished Japan for its past military aggression. War crime trials were held in Tokyo. Former military officers were banned from holding political office. The emperor's power was stripped, and the parliamentary system was strengthened. Land reforms were introduced which benefited tenant farmers and reduced the power of rich landowners. The Allies would go so far as to even dictate a new constitution for Japan. It would seem Japan was indeed becoming Americanized.
What was Harry Truman, George Kennan, John Foster Dulles, Dwight Eisenhower, what were they thinking at this time? A very formative time. You know, this was the end of World War II, the end of the Japanese Empire, decolonization, Cold War, everything was in flux. And strategically, the United States it was really a blank slate. We really did not have a strategic template for Asia.
And yet here's this brilliant policy planner who has ideas in his mind that show zero understanding of the history and the sentiments, shall we say, which are important in East Asia.
The new constitution of post-war Japan has been labeled as Made in USA. It was established under the direction of the American occupying forces led by General Douglas MacArthur, who had final say over the occupation. As said by a Japanese scholar, due to the profound impact American law has made on Japanese law, it is no exaggeration to say that Japanese law after World War II has developed in the direction of American law. Japan's wartime aggression also cost it its military. A clause was incorporated into its post-war constitution, specifying that Japan would never again maintain land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential. Japan's military atrocities during World War II, especially in China, still evokes pain for many around the world, even to this day.
We provided American instructors to help the Japanese police in their training.
Just as in Germany, the Allies wanted to be sure Japan could never again have the capacity to wage war on its neighbors. Japan would have to rely on others, namely the U.S., for protection. But sadly, U.S. military occupation forces would not prove to be good guests in the country.
It was an occupation without precedent in the history of the Orient, and its results are likewise unparalleled. A strong, active friendship grows out of old enmities. A bond of mutual trust and goodwill ties together the people who once were the victors and those who were the vanquished.
The U.S.-led narratives obscured a darker reality. The occupation of Japan was much more violent than commonly known. The local press began to report on rapes and looting just 2 weeks into the occupation, with MacArthur responding by promptly censoring all media. Over time, the number of rapes and assaults on Japanese women rose from 40 a day to over 300. But the U.S. government would suppress important information about crime and punishment, concealing the number of rapes, prosecutions, arrests, and executions. But in the years after Japan's new constitution took effect, Japan's political military alliance with the U.S. strengthened, and Japan's economy would steadily grow. In the 50s and 60s, the United States would become mired in an arms race with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This would cause an imbalance in the allocation of American resources such as capital, labor, and technical competence, which would be lavished on a narrow band of industry to fight the Cold War. Resources that would normally be channeled to domestic and international industries meant to increase America's commercial competitiveness. As a result, the U.S. trade imbalance started deteriorating sharply with other countries, including Japan. In 1971, the U.S. suffered its first trade deficit since records began. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan was improving dramatically. It restored diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, joined the United Nations, and entered a high-growth period.
Over the course of the 1960s, Japan's economy grew astronomically. As more of Japan's goods entered the world market, its reputation for cheap, low-quality goods was gradually replaced with that of admiration for its quality and, in many cases, over-engineering.
Well-made and cheap Japanese products were winning in U.S. markets, especially in traditional American industries such as cars and electronics. But U.S. goods and investments in Japan lagged and failed to secure sizable shares of the Japanese market. The trade deficit grew from $1.7 billion to $50 billion in just 11 years. In the 1980s, the U.S. trade imbalance with Japan stood at 2/3 of the total U.S. trade deficit. U.S. reforms and post-World War II influence had helped Japan grow, but at a rate much higher than the U.S. could have imagined. A panic ensued about Japan's economy overtaking the U.S., leading to a phenomenon dubbed Japan bashing. Harsh criticism of Japan seeped from governmental and business circles to broader audiences through the media and popular culture. Similar to the scorn we see heaped on Mexico and China today, back then it was poured on Japan. Articles were published with catchy headlines like "The Japanning of America" and "Japan buys U.S. with our money." Lawmakers and commentators accused Japanese firms of stealing U.S. intellectual property and taking advantage of unfair trade deals. The messages were powerful, and the public listened.
And Nikki, I hope we can assume that these cars do not have owners.
That's right, Bev. The car you're looking at, a '78 Toyota Corolla, donated by Hoot McInerney in Oak Park. We've got Tim Donovan here taking his frustrations out on this '78 Toyota. This is all in good fun.
This happened in Detroit, where tickets were sold to let people use a sledgehammer to bash a Japanese car. Nationwide, Toyota and other Japanese automakers were blamed for stealing car sales and U.S. jobs, prompting outraged auto workers to smash Japanese cars in protest.
Ron is with me. For $1, they get how many hits on this car?
It's $1 a hit. One hit per dollar.
And this is going to who?
The AdCraft Foundation, which is an advertising foundation here in Detroit. We thought, well, why not a Japanese car? We do all of the Detroit advertising, so why not?
Polls in the 1980s showed Americans were more concerned by the economic threat from Japan than by the military threat from the Soviet Union. The labor union UAW and hardline members of the Congress increasingly claimed that Japan was exporting unemployment. The union took the matter to the International Trade Commission, and auto giant Ford followed suit to request industrial protection measures, hoping to slap import restrictions on Japanese cars. In a situation somewhat like what happened to TikTok in 2023, Japanese carmaker Toyota had to explain at a public hearing why it was innocent. It said the difficulties that the U.S. auto industry was facing were brought by the economic situation and not by imported vehicles. Based on the testimony, the commission voted in favor of the Japanese automaker. But that didn't end the trade friction. As it was an election year, conditions were ripe to politicize the issue. After Ronald Reagan took office, members of his cabinet began asking the Japanese government to place restraints on vehicle exports. In February 1981, a bill was submitted to the U.S. Congress, which would later form the basis for restricting the import of Japanese-made cars. And from here, the story would surprise everyone. At the time, the Reagan administration was still debating whether it should reject the protectionist demands and maintain a free market. In Japan, the auto industry urged all parties to wait until that autumn, when any recovery in the U.S. industry would become clear, and that any action before then would be premature. By this point, the proposed bill was far from becoming a reality. But to everyone's surprise, the Japanese government decided to make a quick political conclusion right away. It signed an agreement to restrict exports of Japanese cars to the U.S. The program was named VER, Voluntary Export Restraint, because it was, frankly, voluntary by the Japanese government. From that point, a slew of new restrictions on Japanese products kicked into effect. In 1983, a 45% tariff on motorcycles, and in 1987, a 100% tariff on Japanese electronics like TVs, computers, and power tools. Things came to a head in 1985 with the famous Plaza Accord, signed among the G5 industrialized nations, the US, Germany, France, the UK, and Japan, which would depreciate the US dollar against the other currencies. The U.S. had been suffering from trade deficits and hoped to remedy this through foreign exchange adjustments. The repercussions came fast and hard. The Japanese yen had been trading at 240 yen to the U.S. dollar, but rapidly appreciated to around 150 yen to the dollar just 1 year later.
Takun Kato remembers vividly when Japan's economic bubble burst in the 1990s. The Japanese yen was strengthening far more than what policymakers were expecting, hurting exporters. A strong yen led to tens of thousands of companies across Japan going bankrupt.
With a stronger currency, Japanese products became more expensive, and the U.S. started to see an increase in exports and its trade deficit lowering. Things quickly turned sour for Japan. More countries turned away from buying its expensive goods. Efforts by the Japanese central bank to keep the yen's value low sparked a stock price bubble, the collapse of which helped push the country into recession, commonly known as Japan's lost decade during the 1990s and beyond. Looking back on it now, Japan's economic downfall seems almost unbelievable. It was the world's largest creditor, but suffered the heaviest blow, while the U.S. was the world's largest debtor, but continued to thrive. The era of Japan bashing ended rather abruptly, as did Japan's golden age. According to Japan's official 1987 diplomatic blue book, the government was well aware of America's deep dissatisfaction with Japan, mainly because of the $58 billion trade deficit. But Japan felt it had no choice but to maintain stable relations with the U.S., as the U.S. ensured security for the nation. Since the end of World War II, Japan has had its constitution, military policies, foreign affairs, trade, and domestic economy all heavily influenced by the U.S. And demilitarization had become a cornerstone of post-war Japan.
Please, look at me.
All right, thank you, Pat.
Thank you, everybody. Strong hands. Thank you, everybody.
But another surprise occurred in 2016, when former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe pushed through legislation that would allow Japan to defend its allies overseas, namely the U.S., even if Japan was not under attack. The government's decision was not largely supported by the rest of the country. Tens of thousands rallied outside Parliament.
And a man set himself on fire at a train station in downtown Tokyo in an apparent protest against the Japanese government's push to reinterpret its pacifist constitution. It looks like this incident has sparked some intense outrage.
I think the current status of politics is a dictatorship. We said we do not want the bills. Since we elected those members of parliament, we want them to listen to us and stop the bills. I think it's wrong for parliament members to pass the bills forcefully. That's why I came here to protest.
With the record spending, Japan's defense ministry plans to buy more fighter jets and patrol aircraft from the U.S. The LDP government, led by Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, is moving its security policy to be even more aligned with its only ally, the United States.
Now, Japan has unveiled plans for its biggest military buildup since World War II.
The $320 billion plan will ready the pacifist country for sustained conflict.
From a U.S. perspective, these were welcome developments. It meant the U.S. wouldn't have to solely foot the bill for military operations in the Indo-Pacific region.
The United States has the largest ever military footprint solely in Japan. So without Japan, the United States could achieve very little when it comes to its engagement in the Indo-Pacific area.
But for the people of Japan, the country was clearly going in the wrong direction.
Building a military base, a place that's associated with killing people, is truly stupid. That's what we want to say to the international community.
I have 4 children and 7 grandchildren, so I come here for them. I won't live that long, but I don't want my children to experience war like I did.
Now, when some children hear the sound of helicopters, they say, "They're back, they're back. We don't want them here."
As the nation to disarm Japan after the war, the U.S. suddenly embraced Japan's new military buildup. A complete reversal. Is this the direction Japan wants to go? Or had it been quietly pressured by the U.S.? And whose interest is best served? Only time will tell.